Ephesians is a letter to the church. It is a beautiful letter, has so much within it that is good. And in chapter 4, it emphasizes one of the aspects of the church that is so essential, yet so non-existent in many religious quarters. And that is the doctrine of unity. You find the Apostle Paul, as he emphasizes this, he says in verses 1 through 6 of Ephesians 4, he says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you, that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called, with all lowliness and meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, even as you're called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. So he sets forth there the aspect of unity. What a glorious thing it is that we strive for, and it's one of the greatest elements of the Lord's church. You find the religious world, they glory in the idea that they're different. And yet God says we ought to glory in being unified. You find that this is a constant plea throughout the Scriptures. In the book of John, the 17th chapter, the Lord himself in his prayer, sometimes we go to Matthew 6 and talk about the Lord's Prayer. That's really a model prayer, but his prayer, one of them, is found there in John 17. And in the midst of that prayer, he prays for himself, for his disciples and such, but in the midst of it, he prays that they all might be one, as he and the Father are one, that the world might believe. And we show there that's his prayer, but it's also a plea that we can be in such a way that we go out and the world sees us and we have this unity. We're agreed. The very fact that we claim to be Christians belonging to Christ, he's in charge. It's his will. And if his will is the standard, then we should be one. And the world ought to know that. That's why it's such a terrible thing to see denominationalism just grows rampantly, and people just, like I said, they glory in their diversity, and God says that's not the way it ought to be. In Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, you find that this unity was brought forth in the ultimate whenever Jesus died on the cross. The only religious division that God ever set forth was between Jew and Gentile, and it was the cross that enabled it to be made of twain one new man. In other words, we can be joined together because of the sacrifice that he gave upon the cross. And then you find here in Ephesians 4 where it again is pleaded for, and similar to what is said in 1 Corinthians 1, whenever there was division, even amongst the church at Corinth, he said, here's the plea that he had to take care of it, speak the same thing, be the same mind, be the same judgment. He was saddened that there was division amongst them, but he gave the cure, determined to have that unity that is there. You know, one of the blessings the elders met this afternoon to deal with, talk about one matter, and one of the things that came up in the discussion is how blessed this congregation is. You know, we have a congregation that is unified, and it is something that takes a lot of work, as we will see. But the blessing of it, you know, in 1 Thessalonians, the 5th chapter, in verse 13, the Apostle Paul says that he, in verse 12, he says, we beseech you to know them that labor among you and over you in the Lord and admonish you. And that's speaking of the elders. But then he says, esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake, and be at peace amongst yourselves. I mean, that latter thing, you know, it is such a joy to be a member of a congregation where we are one, where we have this unity. But it's something we always need to protect. We need to be reminded of the cost of it, that is the cross of Christ, the prayer for it, Jesus' prayer, the plea for it, the inspired word. But in the text we read, he really gives us some building blocks that help us to understand what it takes of me. You know, I can look out and I can say, you need this. And it's right, I know you do. But I need to start with me. I need to see if this is me described here as we strive together for this unity which Paul spoke of by inspiration. And so I look at this, and as you think about the building blocks and how we want to maintain this congregation as it should be and help others to realize what it should be if they're not part of that unity, we need to look at these things and understand what they are. So there again, going back to Ephesians, the 4th chapter, notice there as he points out in verse 2, he begins this discussion of things that help us to understand who I am to be. And he says that we are to have lowliness, meekness, long-suffering, be forbearing to one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So let's look at those, each one, just for a moment. And then, do like James said. Look in the mirror. We do that physically. But he said, you look in the mirror, that is the Word of God, and don't be the person who turns away, but rather receive with meekness that engrafted Word. So I need to look and say, is this me? So the first thing was lowliness. This word, it means a humbleness of mind, a humility that is there. Now James talks about how God resists the proud, but he gives grace unto the humble. Well, pride is something that this world, again, glories in. It's me. You've got to take care of self. You do this. It's all about me. But God says that one of the characteristics we have to have is lowliness. You find the Apostle Paul, and you think about anybody this side of Jesus who is an example of helping and solidifying and strengthening, encouraging, exhorting the Lord's church. It'd be the Apostle Paul. I think we could probably agree on that. In the book of Acts, the 20th chapter, you find as he is speaking there to the church of Ephesus, the elders there, we note that he served with lowliness of mind. You look and you find how to make a church such as the church at Ephesus became. How do you do that? Be one who serves with lowliness of mind. That's a great attribute, isn't it? Where did Paul get that? Well, it began with him becoming a child of God, and that's where it begins with us. It's a complete surrender. Lowliness. It's not about me. Remember Saul, who had become Paul, as he was on the road to Damascus, the Lord appeared to him, and he was convicted then that this was the Christ whom he was persecuting, and he said, "What wilt thou have me do?" It wasn't about him anymore. He talked about that in the Philippian letter. He said, here's all the things that I could trust in, but I count them for dung. He didn't want all those things. They weren't important anymore. They were about him. But he had come to the point, it was, Lord, what do you want? And so he became that servant, not only to the Lord, but to everyone then. He became lowly. Galatians, the 2nd chapter, in verse 20, he says, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So that one who went about boldly defending the religion he knew, which was wrong, it had been taken away at the cross, but he was there taking people, casting them into prison as he persecuted that way. He says, no more. I surrender. You ever sing that song? I surrender all. That's what Saul did, and he became that great servant. The Lord himself said in the book of Mark, the 9th chapter, in verse 34 and 35, that he would be greatest is going to be the servant of all. Now, we seek to be greatest, not in the sense of everybody looking and saying, ooh, do you see him? Do you see her? Do you see what they do? It's greatness that we seek for in being the best we can be in the service of God. And in order to do that, I've got to be a servant. Can't be about me. Can't be about what people think of me as, did they see me do that? Do they know I've accomplished this? Do they know who they're talking to? Do they know? It's about Christ. And it's about helping others to have that relationship with him that I now have. I'm a servant. I'm a servant of his, and I want to teach you how to be a servant of His too. And so we become great in the kingdom, beneficial, productive, because we're a servant. Lowliness of mind. Something that we need to work on, isn't it? And then, of course, he says meekness in verse 2, with lowliness and meekness. Now, meekness sometimes is paralleled with a word that rhymes with it, weakness. You know, if somebody's meek, they're weak. All you got to do is read about Jesus in John the 2nd chapter. You know, Jesus was meek above all, and yet His power was such that He cleansed the temple. But if you look at that incident, you'll find that it really shows you what true meekness is. Meekness is power under control. And so Jesus now, remember when He went into the temple? It was, do you know who I am? Do you? No, He said, you're doing this to my Father's house. He came to do the will of the Father. He was meek above all. He had the power in the garden, remember? He could have called whenever Peter smote off Malchus' ear. He said, I could have called the angels. But how then must it be? Well, what did He mean by that? Remember when He prayed fervently 3 times? Not my will, but thine. His power was under the Father's control. That's us. Do we have power? Do we have abilities? Yeah. But we're not self-assertive. It's not about my interest. I am looking. And I use that power, that ability. You go over to Matthew 25. You know, you can be a 5'2" or 1 talent person. Doesn't matter. Use it to God's glory. You use that ability, that strength, that power you have. You use it in God's service, and you're meek. Something that elders are spoken of as having or needing to have. You find the Apostle Peter, who himself was identified as an elder, and he says to take the oversight, he says, but don't lord it over them. In other words, it is something, you know, one of the things we discussed again in our meeting, you know, we remind ourselves of where and how we serve at times as elders. And one of the things that is always constantly brought out is only realm we operate in is judgment. You know, the expediency, what's the best way to do something? God has set forth what's to be done. So how are we going to do it the best? And in eldership, we strive, and, you know, if we fail at this, tell us. But we strive to set forth things as this is the decisions we make, but it's not a lording it over. It's not just a hammering in. It is ourselves being examples unto the flock. But we should be meek. And it should always be in the forefront, whether you're serving as an elder, whether you're laboring each day, as all of us do as children of God, that what I'm concerned about is God's will. And so, whether I eat, drink, whatsoever I do all to the glory of God. That's where I put my effort, my strength. That's my focus, because I want to be meek, the Lord's way. And so I labor at that, His will. And then I'm to be long-suffering in verse 2. Here is one that some of us, we really, you know, it's sometimes flies up when I study it. It just kicks me right between the eyes. Long-suffering, patient. Don't fly off the handle. Don't be short-tempered. Be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. You know, think about these things. Be long-suffering. Be patient. Show self-restraint, even in the face of provocation. You know, have you ever known anybody that they say, well, I don't know how to push his or her buttons? I've known a lot of people like that. You know, if you have family members, if you've got a brother or sister, you probably know they know how to push the buttons, how to set you off. But long-suffering is learning not to let that happen. You don't let someone else take control that way. It's really the opposite of anger. You know, you ever had anybody say, oh, you don't want to make him mad? I'd hate to have that said of me. You know, the whole idea is you make him mad, he's going to lose it, and if you're around, you're going to be hurt. That's not long-suffering. That's not the way it should be. I need to be a person who is patient, knows how to obtain and use self-restraint. And, you know, kind of like the writer in Proverbs said, you know, a kind answer turneth away wrath. I always think, whenever I think of this, it involves several of these things, but I always think back to Arlo, Essex. And I've told that story several times where a man was in this building. He was drunk, and he was doing things he shouldn't do, and Arlo took him into a room, and I was kind of worried about it, what was going to happen. Here in a minute, the door opens, and here comes Arlo out. He's just guiding the man out, and if you knew Arlo, you knew soft voice he had. You know, just come on now. We're just going to go on out of the building. Man just bucked up. He turned around. He said, I'm just going to whoop you. How do you react to that? Arlo looked at him and said, well, you know, you just might do that. That man's sails were deflated. He had nothing to stand on. He just looked at Arlo and turned around, and he guided him on out of the building. Took care of the matter. So many times we're again, and I know especially with young men it can be that way. You know, you buck up. Nobody's going to talk to me that way. Nobody's going to deal with me that way. Young Christian men, you don't do that. Young or old, male or female. You learn to be long-suffering, self-restraint, even whenever the devil is trying to get you to go. And that's really where it goes back to. And then forbearing. In verse 2 also, and this is kind of akin to that, forbearing. You're long-suffering, so you forbear one another in love. And that is, you put up with it. You know, instead of somebody looking and saying, you know, you don't want to make Jack mad. Wouldn't it be great if people said of you or me, man, he can put up with a lot, can't he? I mean, you know, you can't push his buttons. You can't set him off. Forbearing is that putting up with. Instead of a demanding attitude, it is an attitude, again, I'm a lowly servant. I'm under God's control. I'm long-suffering. So whenever this is here, and what it comes down to is he joins this, of course, with love. I look and I have this forbearing, and you bear with somebody. If you don't love them, you're going to struggle with that. But if you have that love, which we have to all men, you know, and I've said it before, there are some people that I don't really like a lot, but I can honestly say I love them. That is, I seek the best for them. Romans 13 and verse 10, love worketh no ill. I look, and again, because of who I have become, if I'm this person, I'm not seeking my own. I'm not worried about what somebody's going to think for this going on. I'm not worried about how this person's going to think and what they're going to... I'm looking and saying, okay, what's the best way to deal with this situation, with this person, so that the best can come out of it? You know, the Apostle Paul, as he wrote the church at Philippi, in chapter 2 and verse 20, he talked about Timothy, and a sad, sad statement. He talked about sending Timothy, and he said that he had no man like-minded who would just naturally look upon the things of another. I mean, that is a person who is forbearing. You know, you struggle to deal with people, you struggle to deal with a situation, but you look and you think, how can I work this to where it's going to be the best, number one, for God, and thus for this person? That's what forbearing in love is. It's seeking that best. And then you look, the last one there, and this one, this is the one that really gets you. You say, well, what do you mean? Endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit? What kind of that? Well, all these things, you look at it, lowly, meek, long-suffering, forbearing, and love, those aren't easy, are they? They're hard, especially in the world. I mean, the devil has control of a lot of things in this world, and he would love to have us say, might have worked in the first century, but it sure won't work now. If I'm going to make it in this world, I can't be this type of person. If I'm going to take control of this job, if I'm going to take control of this person, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do... And we give up. God says, you got to work at it. You know, you look, endeavoring, it's diligence, it's labor. I mean, this is something, you know, you think about. You look at a situation, you learn from it, and I don't know about you. I mean, I don't guess there's, I would say a day, but hopefully there's a day or two goes by, but that I don't look and say, you know, I'd have done better handling it this way. That's endeavoring. You keep working at it. To be meek, to put my mind in such a way that I'm humble, that I am lowly, that I'm putting my power under His control. I mean, that's something I got to think about. I work and I work and I work. Whenever I have this long suffering, this patience, not just, you learn to count to, you know, some people say count to 10. I'm up to about 50 or 60 now. But you just keep counting if you have to. And that's the diligence. You don't give up at 10. You know, I knew one fellow once, he said, well, you know, I'm supposed to be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, so I count to 10 and then I hit them. Like, how foolish. You know, you don't, if you've got to count to 100, you just keep on counting because you're diligent to have this attitude in you. You are endeavoring, you're laboring, you don't give up, you keep working at it. It's like Paul in the Philippian letter. He says, you know, after he'd said, you know, all of these things, he pointed out the life that he lived. There he was in prison and all these things that people would count on. But you look in the midst of that, and he says, this one thing I do, forgetting the things that are behind, he says, I press on. Did you ever look at that phrase? He kept on pressing. It wasn't, okay, I'll reach for heaven. No, this is the life that he lived. You ever watched a basketball? You know, I watch basketball with the little ones, and I don't understand the whole game, but, you know, I do know whenever they say, okay, coach says press. Got a full court press. In other words, you're going after that ball all the time. That's the life of a Christian. And the ball we're chasing after is lowliness, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another in love. And I just keep pressing on for it. That's the life we live. I don't give up. I don't grow weary in well-doing. If I don't, then I know that I'm going to reap the reward. If I give up, I failed. And unity is disrupted. Peace is not sustained. I am so thankful that I am part of the Lord's church. That we can stand, and there are people who drift away. But whenever we speak of the Lord's church as we ought to, we are one. But more than this congregation, I have seen, as many of you have, congregations that you wonder what in the world they've been drinking, what's in their water. We're blessed, but it comes at a cost. That we never let our guard down. We never stop pressing. We never stop laboring. We endeavor, as he said, we keep on, we endeavor to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And it means that I look at myself in the situations that I face each day, and I say, have I exemplified these attitudes? Are these the building blocks of my life? In other words, am I part of the unity? I pray we all are. And when we are, the reward is great here and in the life to come. If you're not a child of God, you need to realize that without that unity, we become one. Jesus made it possible through his death. The interesting thing is whenever we're baptized into his death in the book of Romans. It was that death, that blood that was shed that made this possible. I become one by the blood of Christ. And then that blood keeps flowing. Whenever I fail, 1 John 1 and verse 7, that blood is there. And I go in verse 9, I seek forgiveness. It's by virtue of that blood. See, we're talking about a blood-bought unity. I can be a part of it by being baptized into Christ. I can remain a part of it by being diligent. And whenever I find myself faltering and failing, I count on that blood and I go back and I ask the Lord for forgiveness and I get back in the fight. I get back to being diligent, endeavoring to seek that unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. If that's your life, God's going to bless you. And you're a blessing to his kingdom upon this earth. If it's not, can be tonight as we stand and sing the song of invitation.